The Innovators in Education series is brought to you by a generous grant from the Nord Family Foundation and in cooperation with the Educational Service Center of Lorain County. I'm your host, Mike Triska, and at the controls is our Director of Innovation and Technology, Dave Miller. This year, we are highlighting innovators in education who are impacting teaching and learning with a focus on blended learning, gamification, coding, and computer science. We are also reaching a much broader audience using a new technology called Talk Show. We can bring in anybody, anywhere, via Skype. Today's topic is blended learning. There are many misconceptions about blended learning, its definition, the different models of blended learning, as well as classroom implementation. To set the record straight, we are going to speak with Thomas Arnett from the Clayton Christensen Institute in California. And we have a special guest host, Mike Lobb from Avon Local Schools, the superintendent of Avon Local Schools. Mike is interested in bringing more blended learning opportunities to his district. But first, here's Dave with some information about how to contribute questions to today's broadcast.
Well, welcome to our broadcast today. I get the easy job over here, so I just get to do the how you post your questions. We're going to be using Today's Meet, and the URL for that is todaysmeet.com/north. You have to spell north with that 2, so it's N-O-R-T, the number 2H, and that will take you to our Today's Meet. The other option is if you actively use Twitter, you can post any question on our Twitter. Just ask the question and use the hashtag, again, north, N-O-R-T, the number 2H. So please be sure to post throughout today, and we'll be sure to throw those questions in as they come. Thanks.
All right, and like I said, we're talking to Thomas Arnett from the Clayton Christensen Institute. Tom Arnett is an education researcher who focuses on changing roles of teachers in blended learning environments. He also studies how teacher education and professional development are shifting to support the evolving needs of teachers in school systems. Before we jump into blended learning, though, go ahead and show Thomas up there. And there's Mike Lobb. Hello, Mike. Before we jump in there, Tom, will you tell us about your background and your role at the Clayton Christensen Institute? Oh, Thomas, don't forget to unmute yourself. There we go.
There we go.
All right, perfect.
All right, yeah, thanks for having me today. I'm excited to chat with you all. So my background, I was a middle school math teacher in the Kansas City, Missouri School District. And after a while teaching, decided I wanted to get involved in innovation. In particular, wanting to find ways to better differentiate instruction for students by leveraging technology. And so from there, I went to grad school and then found my way to the Christensen Institute, where we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank that studies innovations in education and, in particular, how to create the circumstances in a school system to help innovation happen successfully.
Let me ask you this, because as I'm thinking of what you're doing, how many districts then are you getting out to, and are you servicing, are you researching? What's the scope that we're talking about here?
Well, I try and visit districts whenever I travel, and I do different conferences and things around the country. I try and stop in and see districts there. A lot of our research is actually, we have a website called the Blended Learning Universe, where districts go in and create profiles that show their blended learning programs that they've got going on in their district. So we look at those. We also are just following the news all the time, looking for innovative programs to go research and find out more about. And early on, we had a team that was going out and very actively interviewing a lot of the real early adopters, the pioneers in blended learning, to find out about their programs.
Oh, great. And before we get too deep into things, we better hear your definition, or Clayton Christensen Institute definition of blended learning, because we do hear a lot of terminology thrown around out there, especially blended learning, flipped classroom, and they're kind of used interchangeably, and that's not necessarily what should be done. There's definitely definitions and then models that fall under that. So give us your definition of blended learning.
Yeah. So I'll say real quick, this definition came from, in our early research as we went around, we talked to lots of programs that called their programs lots of different things. And we figured, we need some common language so that when people talk to each other, they're on the same page and they mean the same thing. And so this definition came from wanting to meet that need of common language and also wanting to create something that encapsulated a lot of the different variations in programs we saw. So from that research, we came up with this definition. Blended learning is a formal education program in which a student learns at least in part through online learning with some element of student control over the time, place, path, and/or pace of instruction, and at least in part in a supervised brick and mortar location away from home, such as at a school. And then last of all, the modalities along each student's learning path, meaning the online and the face-to-face components. Within each student's learning path or course or subject are connected to provide an integrated learning experience. And that last piece is what we added most recently to the definition, and just it's there to emphasize that it's not going to a computer lab to do typing and then going to your classroom to do math. It's really an integration of what's happening online and what's happening in the brick and mortar face-to-face setting with the teacher.
Good. I like that definition. It really seems to be broad enough that you can implement many different types of models, which I know you're going to explain. But before you do that, tell us a little bit about those misconceptions.
So the main big misconception is that people confuse blended learning with tech-rich instruction. So I want to emphasize, blended learning is not just taking your whiteboard and upgrading it to a smartboard, or taking your textbooks and upgrading them to tablets or Chromebooks using e-text or electronic textbooks. Those are all valuable innovations and they can have valuable impact on student learning, but just changing the technology really doesn't change the instructional model. And blended learning is really about changing the instructional model to leverage the technology to provide personalization.
You know, we didn't talk about this in our pre-interview, but what you just said makes me think of the SAMR model and the different stages. Is that something you go to as a resource when you're talking about blended learning?
Well, tell me more what you mean when you're talking about the SAMR
different
model.
models of technology integration, where you have substitution, augmentation, what is it? What are we? Redefinition and modification. And just instead of using, like you said, I have a tablet in front of me that I'm now doing my word processing on. I just substituted that for something that I used to do. Do you use that type of integration model when you're talking about blended learning, or is there another model that you're using?
When we talk about blended learning, we're talking mostly about the way that you organize and integrate the face-to-face instruction from the teacher with the online piece. And I think an important distinction is, it's not just substitution. It's not just substituting older technology for newer technology. And, considering a textbook is also a type of technology. And you're not just replacing, traditional technologies with new technologies. You're really using the technology to reorganize how you do classroom instruction. And I think as we get into the models, that'll become more clear, and you'll see what I mean by that.
Oh, great. So go ahead, take us through those models. We have about 7 different slides, right? And just explain what all the different models are of blended learning.
So we'll start off on this slide that shows the taxonomy. So as I mentioned, as we were going around in our earlier research on looking at programs, there were lots of programs that said, what we're doing is blended learning, but over there, what they're doing, that's something totally different. And what we realized is that there's just different implementations, different iterations of blended learning. And so we created this taxonomy to try and create, again, common language for people to be able to describe and categorize what it is that they were doing. So in this diagram, you see at the top, you have online learning and brick and mortar learning. They come together, they have a baby called blended learning. And blended learning has 4 models, and the first model has 4 different submodels within it. So I'll walk you through each of those models now. If we can go to the first one, the first category is the rotation models. And within rotation models, there's the station rotation, the lab rotation, the flipped classroom, and the individual rotation. If you can go to the next slide, it shows what the station rotation looks like. So station rotation isn't that different from the learning centers that have been in elementary school classrooms for a long time. The main difference is now you've got one of those learning centers is a computer center where students are doing online instruction. And often what this looks like is a teacher subdivides the class into smaller groups. And that it lets the teacher work with smaller groups and give more personal instruction with those students, more targeted instruction to individual or small groups of students' needs. And then students rotate to, say, a collaborative activity station, or in another segment of the rotation to an online instruction part where they will often get practice in the foundational skills that the teacher's going over. So for example, the teacher may teach a lesson on fractions, and then the students go to the online station to practice working with fractions. So the next model is the lab rotation. The lab rotation is similar to the station rotation in that you've got students moving on a fixed schedule between face-to-face instruction with the teacher and working online. The difference now, though, is that instead of rotating within a classroom, you're rotating between classrooms. So it's often students will have a period during the day when they do their online learning, and then another period of the day when they'll do their face-to-face learning in a more traditional setting with their teacher. If you go to the next model, this is probably one of the most popular, most well-known models, the flipped classroom model. And we categorize it as a rotation model because it's got that same core idea where you have teachers working with students in a face-to-face kind of traditional way, but then you're rotating between the face-to-face and the online. It's just that in this case, the online happens at home. So students do online learning often to watch videos of lectures or read other things that cover the basics of content, and then they go to the school setting, and instead of the teacher having to cover the content in the classroom, the teacher now focuses on doing practice activities or projects or other types of coaching and mentorship with the students.
Let me jump in there real quick with the flip. We got to see a flipped example at my previous school. We did a lot with Discovery Education. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but what was great, always the first assignment of any chapter was a video bank, a glossary bank, some type of assignment where students did exactly what you said. They took it home and they completed the assignment at home either by watching videos or reading an article or even just learning what the vocabulary is going to be for the unit. And then it was so great. They'd come in the next day and you're teaching right off the bat. You're not introducing. It's already been introduced. And it was just a very powerful model that had immediate impact on the classroom. It was really nice how it worked out.
Yeah, cool. That's cool to hear.
All right, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead and jump to that next slide.
So the next slide is a model that we call the individual rotation. And this is where things really start to look different. You can see in this model, you don't really have a big traditional classroom layout. You have often a bunch of computers and students are working online, and a lot of the core instruction is happening online, meaning that's where they get their foundation in the content is the online platform. This starts to allow for much more student flexibility in terms of pacing, because students can be working through a course or a unit at their own pace in the online setting and really taking as little or as much time as they need to really make sure they're mastering the content. Then you'll have students rotate between doing the online learning and then pulling out for, say, direct instruction or a group project or a seminar or an intervention where they're working with their peers or working with the teacher. Now, the reason this is still called a rotation model is because you're still rotating on a schedule. In other words, students will have an hour designated for doing online learning, followed by an hour designated for doing a seminar, followed by an hour for more online, followed by an hour for direct instruction or a group project. And there's still a fixed schedule that dictates how the students move. But this model starts to allow much more personalization in terms of students moving at their own pace. So those are the rotation models, the four models that fall in the rotation category. Now I'm going to talk about the other three. So the next one is the flex model. And you'll notice the flex model looks a lot like the individual rotation. You've got a big area where students are learning online, and then you've got these pull-out areas where students are working with teachers or working with peers in different settings. The big distinction between flex and individual rotation is in flex, you no longer have a fixed schedule for moving between the different modalities. Students kind of just move fluidly based on the needs of that day, the needs of the student. So for example, a teacher may pull up some data and then tell students, hey, at this time today, we're going to pull out and we're going to work on reinforcing some skills that some of you are struggling with. But it's not a daily thing that happens at the same time every day. It really changes based on students' needs.
Hey, Tom.
So the next model, yeah, go ahead.
I want to throw a question in there. I noticed on that diagram over here, you've actually got some social area built into it. Do you find that some of these models require a larger space to be able to effectively implement those?
Typically, that's the case. Usually, flex model or individual rotation, you have a much bigger learning space. Like the schools that do that will often take 2 or 3 classrooms and take out the walls in between those rooms and have a larger group of students that are all kind of working in that big common space together.
Yeah, and the same kind of question with the furniture. You know, we're seeing more and more schools investigate the, you know, I'll use the one that most people are probably familiar with, which is the steel case furniture, but basically furniture that has wheels that can be adopted. Maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but how important is that for the furniture to be easily modified to different configurations for some of these models?
So I'd say the furniture is valuable, but not necessary. And I want to emphasize, it's really important that any school that's considering going blended, you don't start by looking at the devices or looking at the furniture. You start by considering, what is the student learning experience you want to create? Is it that you want to give students more flexibility over their pace? Is it that you want to give students, you know, shift to a competency-based model where students don't move on until they've mastered the content so they can, you know, so they don't have learning gaps? Maybe it's that you want to give students more ownership of their learning to help develop their non-cognitive skills and their goal setting and their planning. So the first place to start is always to consider those questions. What are the goals you want to achieve? And then from there, figure out what's the model, what is the technology, what is the furniture you want to use. But as we've seen a lot of schools that as they get down that path and they start to get to the point where they're asking those questions, they decide, yeah, you know, we need more flexible furniture. Instead of having, you know, desks that are kind of fixed in where they're at, we need to be able to group some students over here and then break that group apart and set up something different over in a different part of the room. So, you know, definitely something we see happening a lot. I just want to make sure I emphasize that it starts with figuring out the instruction model, not figuring out the furniture.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
All right, we'll go ahead and jump on to the next the slide there, and we'll talk about, we have 2 more models, correct? All right.
Yep, 2 more models. So the next one is called the a la carte model. And this one is somewhat distinct from the other models. Usually what this looks like is you'll have a student in a high school or a middle school that's taking periods 1 through 3 or 1 through 4 in a traditional classroom setting. But then, say there's a class that they want to take that the school just isn't able to offer. Maybe it's Arabic, maybe it's you know, some kind of specialized music class or photography class. And so the school may not have the staff, may not have the capacity to offer a full course for, you know, a bunch of students, but they can set up and contract to have an online course. Or maybe they have one teacher providing that course, not just for the one school, but for the entire district. So in this model, the student will go to their regular classes, and then for one period of the day, they'll go work on this online course. Now this model is the only model where the teacher of record is an online teacher, meaning the student doesn't meet face-to-face with their teacher. But what the student does have at the school side is other supports, often paraprofessionals or tutors or just someone else that they can, you know, someone else that's at the school site supporting them in their learning. But the teacher is an online teacher, and they're taking this virtual course as a supplemental course.
All right, great.
Now the last model is what we call the enriched virtual model, and this model really came about as a kind of an improvement and innovation on top of fully virtual learning. Basically, some virtual schools realized that some of their students needed some face-to-face support. They needed to be able to check in with a teacher face-to-face to have the teacher, you know, make sure that they're making progress in their course, and for the student to be able to ask the teacher questions from now in a face-to-face setting. And so in this model, students often do the bulk of their learning online at home, but they come into a school site maybe for 2 or 3 hours a day for maybe 2 or 3 days a week to check in, meet with their teacher face-to-face, get mentorship, get support, and then go back and do more of their coursework in an individualized pace online. So those are the blended learning models.
All right, great. Lots of options, which is fantastic. I'm going to throw it over, though, to Mike, because I know he has questions for you, as he's very interested in doing, like I said, more of this in his district. He already has some groups of teachers that have jumped onto it already, but yeah, he's dying over here to ask you.
Yeah, I'm jumping at the bit here a little bit. First of all, thank you. That was, I like the way that you have those defined, and I think a lot of school districts, and I think a lot of people don't know this, but I believe a lot of school districts are doing either those models or pieces and parts of those models already. For Avon, and I'll be a little selfish here and ask an Avon question. We really have done a lot of infusion of technology into what we're doing with students over the last 4 years. That includes the device piece, that includes building a new building and thinking about that as we built the building. One of the questions that I have is, we, of course, whenever you do something different, professional development is a big part of what you do, because we want to make sure that people are comfortable with the model and what we're doing and how we're using technology with students, because we don't want technology to be a class that people or that kids go to. We want technology to be something that's done every day in many classes, if not all classes. What professional development models have you seen, and what things should we think about as a school district as we go down that road with our teachers and give them the opportunity to learn and apply?
Well, first of all, I want to say I think that's you're thinking right along the right lines, because professional development is really critical to all of this. Teachers they go through graduate school or they go through teacher prep and they learn certain approaches to teaching. And then as they go into their career and as they teach year after year, they develop certain practices that work for them. And so one of the big challenges is that when you shift to one of these models, often you're asking teachers to set aside some of their practices and learn a whole bunch of new practices. And that can be challenging because teachers are busy and they've got every day, they've got students in front of them and they've got to know what to do. So I want to say, first of all, that professional development is really key for the success of these models. In terms of what we've seen be successful for different approaches to professional development, I'll highlight a few things. One is there are a number of free resources out there online now that let teachers quickly learn about these models and learn about not just the models, but really learn about how to operationalize them in their classrooms. Things like, how do you go about handing out devices? How do you plan a lesson that involves technology? And so one resource to support you to is the Relay Graduate School of Education. If you go to learn.relay.edu, I believe, they've got a number of online courses that are just quick modules on how to do blended learning in your classroom if you're a teacher. Another resource is there's a company called Better Lesson that recently went out and interviewed a whole bunch of blended learning teachers that have been doing that for a while and gathered resources from those teachers and has now documented online. Here's the resources, the practices, the approaches that these teachers have found to be successful for them. So if you go to, if you search for the Better Lesson Master Teacher, the Better Lesson Blended Master Teacher Project, you can find those resources. In addition to that, there's a few companies out there that will provide consulting on blended learning, and they have their own PD. Also, if you adopt software, often companies will give you PD on how to implement their software. But one thing I want to really touch bases on is that probably what we've seen be the most successful approach is, there's a lot that changes when you shift to one of these models, and it takes teachers a while to figure it out. So what we've seen some schools do, and what's worked really well for them, is to find in the school or in the district who are those few teachers that are really excited about going through the steep learning curve of figuring this stuff out, and then giving them the resources and the autonomy to really figure out how to do it well. And then as those teachers figure out how to do the blended learning models well, they do two things. One is they create credibility. They can show, hey, here's the results I've had, which helps get broader buy-in. But then they also have the institutional knowledge of, hey, I've done this before. I can help other teachers troubleshoot and figure out some of the logistics that are hard to figure out at first. So that's, I think, been one of the keys to success for a lot of schools, a lot of districts that have gone this route. One other thing I'll point out too is that some models are easier than others to implement. The flip classroom and the station rotation are probably the easiest models for a teacher to just pick up and do on their own, because they don't require changing the bell schedule, they don't require coordinating with other teachers in classrooms, they don't require knocking down walls and buying new furniture. So that's another thing to keep in mind, is that some of the models lend themselves well to teachers just figuring them out and getting and diving in quickly to do these. Other models require much more coordination and planning on the part of not just the teacher, but often the whole instructional team and the school staff and often district staff as well.
I appreciate that. You know, the thing that I would say and I'm excited about in Avon is the fact that we've had a lot of people just kind of jump off the cliff and go after it. You know, we've been able to provide some support and some devices and some opportunities, and we've seen, especially at the high school and middle school level, people kind of take it and run with it, and we have a lot of blended learning going on. We're proud of that, and I see that expanding as we move. The only other question I had for you about blended learning and about what you're seeing around the country or in your studies of what are classrooms going to look like 5 years from now? Because as we plan in Avon and we plan in Northeast Ohio, Lorain County, what we want to make sure we're doing is we're setting ourselves up both financially and structurally and professional development-wise to put ourselves in a position where we're going to build towards where this thing's really going rather than trying to just catch up to the here and now. It's more financially responsible, and it's better planning on our part and less frustrating for staff if we're doing the things we need to do right now to go where we want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now. Any trends, anything you're seeing that is pointing you in a specific direction or that we should think about?
So in the near term, we see a lot of schools going to the rotation models, the station rotation, the lab rotation, the flipped classroom model. Because like I said, those are the easiest to adopt, and they are the least risky in terms of there's not as much to figure out, so you can quickly roll those out with your core instruction, with your math and your language arts and your core classes. The other models, the individual rotation and then the non-rotation models, we see those as really being the future in the long term. But in the short term, there's a lot of work that has to be done within a district to figure out how to make those models operate well. And so we see those often starting off more in the periphery, outside of core instruction, in elective courses or after-school programs or summer school, for example, and school systems figuring out how to run those models well in these lower stakes settings, and then in the long term bringing those in and making them more mainstream. Now, I think what's really exciting to think about is that those other models really unlock a lot of potential for things like competency-based learning, things like really focusing on empowering students to be agents of their own learning and to set goals and to manage their own learning pathways and really get excited about instruction, because it can be much more personalized to their interests and to where they're at, and in ways that really help every student to be successful. But there are some key pieces in terms of, if you're going to those models, it often means changing the layout, changing the architecture of your rooms, knocking down walls to make bigger classrooms. There's also a lot of policy pieces that need to go with it as well. So for example, if you're shifting to a competency-based model, you've got to figure out, how do you take, if you've been doing letter-based grades for a long time, how are you going to make that shift from letter-based grades to competency-based grades? Another big piece is also communicating with parents and families, because often parents will look at what you're doing, and if it looks different than what they saw as good education when they were growing up, they'll have some reservation and they'll think, what is this new stuff you're doing? And so that's another key piece, is really communicating with the parents and the community to say, the key piece is not just to say we're doing this technology based initiative, but to talk about, here's the type of personalized learning experience that we want to be able to offer students. And therefore, these are the new instructional models and the new technologies we're moving towards and we're adopting to give your student the individualized learning experience that they need and that they deserve.
Thank you.
Any more questions along those lines?
Let me throw this one in there. You said that the station rotation and the flip model are the ones that you're seeing a lot of. Is it mostly station rotation at the primary level and then flipped at the high school, or does it just kind of run the spectrum?
Yeah, it tends to group that way. Flipped is more common in the high school, station rotation more common in the elementary. A lot of that, depends on, high school students have more maturity, and you can give them a little bit more ownership and accountability to go do things at home. So flip tends to work better there. Station rotation, often, like I said, it's not that different from the classroom centers that elementary school teachers have been doing, and so that one tends to be quite popular there.
Oh.
But I will say, though, they're not exclusive to that. We do see different models being used in both primary and secondary.
Now, you highlighted those two. What would be the next one on the list that you see more people implementing, or that would be the easiest for our teachers to start in their classrooms?
Well, those two, if it's just a teacher on their own, those two are probably the easiest and maybe the only ones that a teacher can do on their own because they don't require coordination. But we also see the lab rotation being fairly common, and then the flex being common, mainly because I think a lot of schools that are really trying to be forward thinking look at the flex and they say, hey, that's the future. Let's figure that one out. But I will say the a la carte is common, but often not noted because often schools don't see that as a school-wide blended learning program. They just see that as something that we can add as an additional service to our students. So that one is actually pretty common too, as schools are thinking about how can we offer learning experience to our students that right now we just don't have the capacity to provide.
All right, great. Hey, we're going to throw it over to Dave. He has a question from our audience, I believe. Dave?
Mm-hmm.
I think I muted myself, sorry. Let me repeat that. So what advice do you have for
I
districts?
can hear you better now.
Yeah, sorry. What advice do you have for districts interested in bringing blended learning to their district? Is there something that is just a great thing that saves people a lot of time or failure?
Mm-hmm. So a couple pieces of advice there. One is to go out and research what are other districts doing. For example, I mentioned our blended learning universe. If you go to blendedlearning.org/directory, you can go look up other schools that are doing blended learning, and you can even search by geography and find schools that are close to you. And so it's going out and finding out what others are doing. Also studying up on the literature. We have a number of white papers and other guides on our website where you can go and learn about blended learning at this high level of conceptually, what is it, where is the future of education going in terms of blended learning. So I think that's a key piece. The next piece of advice I give is really starting with what are the goals that you want to achieve with blended learning? What is the instructional experience? And I've emphasized that before, I'll say it again. You think about what is it that you want to change about your students' learning experience? And from there, then how are you going to track and measure progress against that? Is it going to be in terms of graduation rates? Is it going to be in terms of improved student test scores? Is it going to be student surveys and asking students about their perceptions of school? How much, what they like about their school experience? Once you figure out those goals and the metrics for tracking the goals, then start to design the learning experience for the students. And often that means bringing together teams of people from different classroom teachers, leaders in curriculum, and working together to figure out what that new model should look like. And then at that point, then deciding, okay, what's the right model? What is the right technology for us to go about delivering this experience?
All right, and you mentioned resources, and you gave us a lot of great resources there. Your website is also a great resource. And if you visited Khan Academy, which I'm sure you have because your videos are on there, but for our audience, Khan Academy has a great collection of blended learning videos. It will actually walk you through the different models. It will give you that nice overview, the definitions, and what I really liked is it showed blended learning classrooms in action. So you could actually go in and see what a classroom looks like. So you hit a ton. Are there any other really whiz-bang websites that we should go to?
Some other organizations that have good resources. The Learning Accelerator is an organization that's focused, very, very intensely on how do we help districts adopt blended learning. So they have some great resources. Again, that's the Learning Accelerator. And then another one I'd say is if you're into the phase of picking what are the devices and the software, there's a news organization called EdSurge. So if you go to EdSurge, they have a database where you can look up different reviews of different pieces of software and get a sense for, what's out there. What are the things that you can use to support blended learning?
All right, fantastic. I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Thanks to Tom Arnett from the Clayton Christensen Institute. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and definitely thank you to Mike Lobb from Avon Local Schools. It was a pleasure having you in to take some of the pressure off of me because This stuff just drives me crazy. Dave, he does it on purpose. He makes me sit here. But anyways, we look forward to hearing more from both of you. And again, we'd like to thank the Nord Family Foundation and the Educational Service Center of Lorain County for making this broadcast possible. Stay tuned for tomorrow's broadcast. We have a noon broadcast featuring Mike Lynch, Matt Miller, Jeremy Shore from Mentor Schools. They're going to actually dive deeper into blended learning, and we're going to discover how Mentor is using their Catalyst Research Facility to bring blended learning to their teachers. Signing off from the North Green Screen Studio, I'm Mike Triska, encouraging you to implement some of the great ideas you've heard today, and most of all, make tech fun. Thanks.